No, you are not poor. Cars are, in fact, completely unaffordable, and the statistics, especially the recent statistics, definitely support this. Let's start off this conversation by going over the unemployment rate and the underemployment rate. So unemployment, you don't have a job, you're looking for one. Underemployment, you don't have a job, you're looking for one, or you are working a job that is lower than what you are currently qualified for. So today, the unemployment rate stated to be about 4.4%. The underemployment rate's like 8.1. 10 years ago, unemployment was over 5% and underemployment was over 10%. So it looks like things have gotten better on the surface, but there's a couple things that are different today than they were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, you went to an employer, they hired you as part-time or full-time. Whereas today, a lot of employers aren't hiring people. Instead, they are hiring you as a contractor, so you're your own business owner, right? They don't give you any actual benefits because you're not an employee of the company, and your pay is a lot more sporadic because you're just a contractor. I mean, look at like Uber drivers, for example. I mean, that's a great example where they, instead of a company hiring taxi drivers, you instead have a company that is contracting people to be the taxis, and they're employees, but they're not employees at the same time, right? It's kind of the gray world that we live in. The other thing to note is that I don't think that these stats are actually accurate, because there's a lot of people, especially in my generation, Gen Z, that are just not looking for a job whatsoever. And so they're not going to pop up on these stats because they're not, not employed and looking for a job, right? They're unemployed and they're not looking at all. And so they're technically, they should be a part of the workforce and they're not. And so I bet if we actually threw them into the statistics, I don't know exactly the number would be, but it would be a lot higher, probably double at least of what we currently have, even maybe more. Okay, so we probably have fewer people working today than we did 10 years ago, and people have less benefits that are working, but are they at least making a little bit more money? Well, on paper, technically, yes, but then when we take into account the price of cars, which is the main thing in this video, no, they aren't making more. So currently, the average individual makes a little bit less than $50,000 a year, $47,960. If you're a full-time worker, the average person's making over $60,000 a year. 10 years ago, the average individual was making about $30,000 a year. So people have actually seen some level of income increase. Full-time workers on average were making over $50,000 per year. So what you're seeing is the average person's actually making a much larger amount compared to what they were 10 years ago, but the average full-time worker is not making that much more today than they were. I mean, you're talking about $17,000 increase for the average person and only $10,000 increase for a full-time worker. So like full-time workers are getting the short end of it big time, especially when you take into account the percentage increase with that. And again, I think this goes down to companies doing a lot of contract work rather than actually hiring people. Now, if we bring in car stats to this, it gets really crazy. So the average brand new car 10 years ago was about $33,000. The average brand new car today is over $50,000. So you're a hardworking full-time worker 10 years ago. You're making over $50,000 a year. You decide to treat yourself to a brand new car. Well, you can get that brand new car for less than what you're making in a year. Almost half what you're making in a year. Not quite, but getting close. Today, however, you're that same hardworking full-time worker, and if you want to buy a brand new car, it is almost your yearly salary, especially when you take into account taxes and interest. It's definitely going to be your yearly salary, because 10 years ago, interest rates were lower than they are currently when it comes to what we're seeing with car loans. So it's no wonder as to why these new cars are selling in much lower volume amounts. People just can't afford them. And again, the stats 100% show this, because if you look at car sales 6-7 years ago, the new car market saw over 17 million vehicles sold per year, whereas now we're lucky if we're going to crack 16 million this year. And I actually think that the overall volume is going to dramatically decrease over the next few years unless there is a major change when it comes to the prices of these new cars and then also with the interest rates. But even if interest rates come down, I don't think that the new car market is ever going to fully recover because of complexity with cars. Not only are these cars unaffordable for the average person, they're also way too complex. If we look at a car from 10 years ago, well, this was before the federal government mandated backup cameras in vehicles. So a lot of cars didn't even have a screen. A lot of cars just had a basic radio and cruise control. And a lot of cars back then still had power windows and everything, but they were a lot more basic than they are now. Whereas you look at like the average car now, and every single car has a touchscreen pretty much, right? There's very few that don't have a touchscreen at this point, or they have to have at least some sort of screen to display the backup camera, because it's a federally mandated law to have a backup camera in a car. So every single car has a screen. And pretty much every single car now has at least blind spot monitoring. Most of them have adaptive cruise control. They've got lane departure, collision assistance, all this safety tech. And some of this is certainly useful, but it also just adds complexity to cars. And now you're seeing cars with like screens all across the dash, and the suspension systems. This is another thing that I don't think gets highlighted enough. 10 years ago, most cars just had regular old school suspension. Like when I say old school, it was, springs and shocks and, axles, and that's it, right? It was very simplistic stuff. Whereas now you're seeing, cars will have height adjustable suspension. That's becoming more and more common. The cars will have shocks that adjust depending on the drive modes. And then, now with cars 10 years ago, they had hydraulic steering, whereas a lot of them now have electric power steering. And so you have adjustments for the steering feel. There's just so much more electronic stuff in cars now and so much more adjustment. And some of this has benefits, right? Like the car behind me with its electric power steering is really comfortable to drive off-road, because you don't get the kicking back and forth over the rocks and everything, and you don't have to worry about snapping your wrists, right? So there's some benefits to it. But the downside with this complexity is a lack of reliability. I mean, we are seeing this big time. If you look at every single car brand, the amount of repairs needed per 100 vehicles is just astronomical compared to what it was 10 years ago. I mean, there were some brands that had fewer than 100 repairs needed for 100 cars. That doesn't really exist anymore. Pretty much every single brand, even like Toyota, if I, last time I looked at the statistics, I mean, they're at least close. So I think they're over. I mean, Lexus that's behind me, I think that they're well over 100 repairs needed for every 100 cars at this point. Again, don't quote me on those stats. I should have pulled that up before the video, but the point still stands. There's a lot more complexity with these cars. There's a lot more going wrong. And so people are now in a situation where a new car is completely unaffordable with the price. And even if they could afford it, they can't afford to keep it on the road anymore. Like, while it's under warranty, that's fine. But most car warranties are only, 4 or 5 years. Some of them are a little bit longer, but 4 to 5 years is pretty standard. And so after that, it's like if something breaks, you got to foot the bill. And aftermarket warranties, they're okay, but they don't cover nearly as much as you would want. And finally, here is my prediction of what is going to happen moving forward. Old cars are going to continue to be valuable, and they're going to continue to go up in price. Because even though someone might have to pay a premium for a 10, 15, 20-year-old car, they have peace of mind of knowing that stuff is unlikely to break, and when it does break, it's going to be cheap to replace or less expensive to replace, right? If you have a 20-year-old car with solid axles and leaf springs, for example, and the suspension goes out, that's dirt cheap to replace compared to a modern car with height adjustable suspension and adjustable shocks, right? So I think that those are going to continue to go up in value. New cars are going to continue to sell in smaller and smaller numbers, and this is going to cause automakers to go out of business, at least here in the US market. I mean, here's a good example. I want to make a dedicated video to this. Here in Utah, we've already lost a few franchises. Maserati doesn't exist in Utah anymore. Alfa Romeo doesn't exist. I think Jaguar just recently is no longer in the state. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's other, smaller brands like Infiniti. I don't know how much longer they're going to last, right? In terms of having as many franchises as they do in the US market. Acura is another kind of like small, and it always starts with luxury, right? Whenever you have an industry that is, quote unquote, this is kind of too big of a word, but collapsing, we'll say collapsing, the luxury always gets cut off first, and then it goes into the non-luxury. And so I think that trend's going to continue, where you're going to see dealerships just go out of business, just cease to exist, because when you go from a market where you have over 17 million buyers per year to now there's maybe 15 million, you shrink that down to the scale of a few dealerships in an area. Well, those dealerships maybe went from selling 200 cars per month each to now they're only selling 150 each, or maybe they're only selling 100 each. Right? The volume just keeps decreasing, and then their service and parts department's making less money, and the automaker is obviously making less money from that because they're selling fewer parts, right? People that have older cars don't typically change them out with OEM parts, right? Because OEM parts are always more expensive, and a lot of times they're not as good. You know, aftermarket parts can be higher quality. So all this stuff is coming together to where, unless there is a major change with pricing with these new cars and interest rates come down with new cars, you're going to see a situation where the new car market in the US, I'm not going to say full on collapse, but we're going to lose a lot of brands. We're going to see a lot of consolidation like we've seen in other industries. And that'll be interesting moving forward in terms of what those brands end up doing or not doing. So let me know your thoughts.